After my last video on Richard Murphy versus Gary Stevenson, a lot of you gave your views. I've been going through the comments and they're interesting. Some of you agree with Gary and others with Richard. Many of you raised excellent points that forced me to think harder about where I stand. Since then, I've gone back and watched both of their videos again, slowly and really carefully, and I've realised that there are places where my original summary smoothed over too much. Media-friendly sound bites inevitably simplify things, and I thought it was important to be more precise about where these two guys really differ. They actually agree on quite a lot, and to the extent that they don't, they're talking about different things. Both Gary and Richard frame the current economic situation as a form of class war. Both argue for solidarity between non-rich higher earners and the working class, and both want a fairer distribution of wealth. We can all agree on that. But the disagreement comes down to how they describe the government's finances, and this matters because it shapes what people believe is possible. Here's where my thinking has shifted slightly, and this is where I need to be clearer than I was in the last video. First, I gave the impression that Gary was wrong about the UK running out of money. Gary isn't wrong if you're talking about the UK under current law and market behaviour. Right now, the government can't just tell the Bank of England to add zeros to its account to fund spending, except in very limited exceptional circumstances. In normal times, it has to borrow by issuing bonds. And yes, if markets lose confidence, that can become difficult or expensive. In that sense, Gary's framing matches the operational reality today. Second, Richard is also not wrong if you're talking about the potential of a sovereign currency issuer in a reformed system. This is the view set out by modern monetary theory, which Richard advocates. MMT starts from the fact that a government that issues its own currency can never literally run out of it. It can always create more. In that framework, therefore, the government's capacity to spend is limited only by real resources and inflation, not by running out of pounds. But that's a different conversation. It's about proposing a change to the system, not describing the one we have. Richard is an advocate of this model. Gary, on the other hand, is working within the system as it currently operates, where the government must finance its spending through taxes or borrowing. Gary's position is rooted in the here and now, I think. He says that the government has been financing spending by running down its wealth, selling off assets, and now that those are depleted, it relies on borrowing, and at some point lenders can refuse to lend if they believe they won't get paid back. And that leaves two choices: slashing spending, austerity, or raising taxes. And he thinks the government will avoid taxing the super rich and instead hit higher earners who aren't rich in the billionaire sense, what he calls the middle classes. His point is that these people should join forces with the working class because the very wealthy are winning the class war. Richard's view overlaps on the inequality point. He also calls it class war, but he rejects Gary's whole framing about the UK running out of money. He says the Bank of England creates new pounds every day, and because the UK issues its own currency, it can never run out. From Richard's perspective, tax doesn't fund spending, and borrowing doesn't fund spending either. These are political constructs, not operational necessities. The danger, he says, is that Gary's framing legitimises the neoliberal myth that spending has to be paid for in advance, which is then used to justify austerity. I think both of them are actually right in their own contexts. Gary's argument works within the existing neoliberal framework and under today's rules. Yes, the government does need to raise revenue or borrow to spend. Richard's argument works within an MMT framework where the government's spending capacity is limited not by the balance sheet but by real resources and inflation risk. In one of the comments to my video, someone asked, "Isn't this just semantics?" And in large part, I think it is. But this is where it gets interesting. In orthodox framing, big public spending plans must be justified by pointing to where the money comes from before you spend. This is then used to justify austerity and block ambitious investment. On the other hand, in MMT framing, the question is, do we have the resources and skills to deliver this without causing inflation, which changes what is politically possible? Both approaches require a tax system in the end, but the sequencing changes the politics and the psychology of public spending. It may sound like semantics, but in the short term, markets will react to those semantics. That's why I don't think Richard is right to say that Gary is outright wrong. They're working from different rule books. Gary's sticking with the rules as they are. Richard wants a completely different set of rules. My own view? I do think we need much bigger changes than just taxing wealth. I've talked a lot about this in my own videos, so I sympathise with Richard's ambition. But I also think Gary's work is vital because he's speaking in a way that cuts through to people inside the current system. We need both, the incremental changes that work within the system and the bold ideas that push us to change it entirely. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. I'd really appreciate that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.